Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And basically what we're going to do is do the second front end in our sort of marathon of creating front ends for the same back end. And the second one's going to be with using Angular. This is specifically, I think, right now on Angular version 9. A little history on Angular. Um, Angular is created by Google. React, which we did first, was created by Facebook. And these are sort of the two biggest of the front end frameworks. And Angular is known for being a very robust option. Like if you look at the documentation for um, Angular, like it's a lot of features. Okay, you can pretty much spend. The reason is that Angular is meant to be sort of a complete solution. It has a way to do everything. So like on React, React is sort of a core UI library. So far as how you handle your API calls, it's up to you. You could use Axios, you could use Fetch, you can use whatever library you want. How do you handle forms? How do you handle all sorts of things? Are little, there's not as much sort of a canon way of doing things. So when you work across different teams who use React, you might find very different conventions, very different standards, very different approaches. Do they use style components? Do they use CSS? Do they use Sass? Do they create, a style sheet for each individual component? Do they create one master style sheet? There's also the different um, differences. Do they use TypeScript? Do they use JavaScript? So React is very flexible in that regard. Angular, on the other hand, has its own solution for everything. It has its own solution for making API calls, its own solution for handling forms, its own solution for browser routing, etc., etc., etc. So it makes Angular have a much steeper learning curve because basically for everything to kind of work nice and perfect, you kind of have to kind of understand all the Angular pieces and how they fit together, and understand the ecosystem. The benefit though is that once you learn the ecosystem, it gets a lot easier because there's a lot less thinking about how do I do it. There's a way to do it. Everyone does it the same way, and this is why a lot of big companies like to use it because they know that if you have one Angular developer and another Angular developer, since everything is so standardized and robust, you can pretty much swap them out. Um, Now, Angular used to dominate. Now, what happened was that there was an older version of Angular. It goes up to Angular, I think, 1.7. That's referred to now as Angularjs. Now, as React became sort of the new shiny toy in town, Angular wanted to update its framework to sort of be cooler than React. So they did that, and starting with Angular 2, they kind of did a complete redo of the framework, which means all the old code just didn't work with the new framework. Like if you wanted to switch over from 1.7 to 2, it was basically you had to rebuild your app. And a lot of companies don't want to rebuild their apps. So a lot of companies kept using AngularJS, which is still, I think, still supported for a little bit longer. Angular, I think it's Angular, I forget the website, angularjs.org. Okay, and but it's no longer updated. So it's just like long-term support, which just means that they still update it for security because there's so many big companies that used it and that didn't want to spend the money on rebuilding their websites. But I think over the next year, this finally goes out of support. Let's see here. July 1st, entered a 3-year long. So that would make it 2021 when that sort of becomes no longer supported. So the AngularJS is actually pretty easy to learn. But again, won't be supported after like a year from now. So it has a short, and the idea is that companies have been making the switch from AngularJS over the last several years, from AngularJS to React to newer Angular to Vue, whatnot. So this is kind of a dying form. But there's a difference between AngularJS and just plain Angular, which refers to Angular's version 2 and above. So right now, Angular version 9 is Angular. And it's, again, a very robust framework. Lots to learn. So let's get started. So I think my backend server is still running. Yep, listening on port 4000. Now let's go over here. Now, first thing you always want to do is you need to download the Angular CLI. So let's go over here to get started. Getting started, setup, lots of docs. So you would install this. I've already done this, but you would do this command, which would install the Angular CLI onto your computer, so that way you can run commands from your command line. And I'm going to go to my lots of apps folder. Let me just clean all this up a little bit. And we're going to create a new project. So ng new. So we're creating a new project. Ng new Angular front end. Okay. Similar to how we called our previous React front, except Angular has to be a dash, not a underscore. So ng new Angular front end. I think that's it. So you just enter there. Enter here. And that's going to get this started. This is going to take a while, a lot longer than spinning up a React app. But again, it's because like Angular gives you everything. Would you like Angular routing? Not for this particular project. We're just going to do everything in one component. We will use CSS, so you can choose what styling you want. We'll just use CSS. Or, try that again. Let's show stylus. I've never actually used stylus before. Sass and CSS is kind of my jam. So yet a note for Angular routing. Let's just stick to plain old CSS. See, I'm not going to do any styling for this exercise. So let me just delete this, what it already did. I have to do this again. Delete. Okay, good. Okay, let's do this command again. Ng new Angular front end. No, I don't want browser routing. CSS. Okay, now it's going to do its thing. This is going to take a long while, so I'm going to pause this while this does this, and we'll continue on once it's done installing. Okay, so it's finished installing. So now we're going to cd into the folder. Cd. And then we're going to type in ng-serve, which is a command for Angular to start a server in any Angular application. So we will do that. While that starts up, I have a third bash terminal that I'm going to want to cd into that folder. So cd, lots of apps, cd, and there we go. And then let's clear the terminal. There we go. We go back here, see how the server's going. Oh, the first time I was going to ask you for this privacy thing. Yes, share my information in case there's any errors that can help them fix the framework. So that's going to start out. Let's take a look at the folder structure. So here's what you get inside a Angular application. Most of this you know how to deal with. Anything regarding Karma is for testing. Karma is a testing library. All the tsconfig stuff is for configuring TypeScript. Because that's another thing about Angular 2 and above, now Angular 9, is that it works with TypeScript. So it doesn't hurt to know sort of the basics of TypeScript. You can get away without knowing it. It will, I mean, most of the things you need to know about TypeScript for the purposes of working in Angular are things you'll pick up in the documentation. But just kind of knowing the difference between sort of what's Angular and what's TypeScript isn't necessarily a bad thing. And here Angular has its own config. So there's a lot of config files. Okay, configuring tslint, configuring TypeScript, configuring Node, configuring Angular itself. And again, all those details are in the documentation. But to build a basic app, you don't need most of that. Although to build a basic app, Angular may be a lot of overhead. Okay, so we go to the source folder. This is where you can do all your work. And then even most of these folders and files you're not going to touch. Test.ts, styles. This is just sort of a default style sheet you can use for global styles. Every time you create a component, so if we go to app, that's where all your components are going to be. There's a default app component. That's your main app component. And anytime you'd like to create like another one, you would just use your CLI. So if I would go over here, that's still building out. Everything takes a while in Angular. You would just use this command, ng generate. And you can say ng generate component, and then the name of the component, or ng generate service, which we'll be using later, and then the name of the service. There's all sorts of things you can generate in Angular, and it'll just put the files you need here, which makes life a little bit easier. But this is essentially the setup for any component. So every component is built up into 3 files. There's the CSS, so you would put all your CSS in this file for that component. I'm not going to put any CSS in this. Then here's the app, the template, the HTML file, which is just the code for how things look like. And I won't change that until after we see sort of it pop up. Then there's this component spec.ts. That's just the test, the page with using Karma. So I'm not going to get into testing, but it's something that's built in. And then here's the actual TypeScript file. And this is where you would build out all your functions, put all your variable datas, do all the JavaScript stuff. So usually like in React, it's kind of all in the JavaScript. It's all in the JavaScript, and then you kind of embed what's called JSX. Here, it's just 3 files. So the actual appearance of your website, the HTML, is going to be separate than the programming logic, which is this TypeScript. And since it's using TypeScript, it's using an experimental feature called decorators, which set up a lot of the basic details of your component. So such as if you wanted to use your component as an HTML tag, this would be the selector app root. This is where the template's located, so you can change these things. And this is the style sheet that it'll apply to this particular component. Okay, so that gives all the information for how it's going to build this component. And then Angular has like a lot of extra pieces. So basically there's the core Angular library, which allows you to render components, interpolate data, do some basic data binding, click events. But there's other things you're going to want. You're going to want like its form features that allow you to create two-way data binding between forms. You're going to want its HTTP client, which allows you to create observables, which allow you to create sort of objects that allow you to make API calls to an endpoint. But all these don't come out of the box ready to go when you spin up an Angular project. So this is here called app module.ts. So anytime you want to add any kind of feature from Angular, you have to import the module here. So you'll have to go find where it is in the library here, add an import, and then add it to the array of imports over here in order to use it. And we're going to add 2 things. We're going to import, I think it's the forms module from at Angular forms, and then we're going to import HTTP client. I forget if it's HTTP client module, but it should be from at Angular common / HTTP. And then we would import. So this is the file. This is the library or the module that has all the stuff with binding form values, because we're going to create a form to add to-dos. And then this is the module that has the HTTP client, which is Angular's built-in way of doing API calls. I could just use like fetch or Axios, but the idea is to show you sort of the Angular way of doing things. This is what they intend you to do. Okay, and then I would just add those over here to the imports. So forms module and HTTP client. Let me just see this thing. This thing ever finish building? Okay, so it did finish building. Never did open up a site. Or did it? No, I see that it did. So let's open it up. Oh, it's because I didn't put the open flag. That's why. You're supposed to put ng serve -- open, so that way it opens up the browser for you at the end. So that's the local host. I said 4200. And there it goes. And this is sort of the default Angular page that's being served currently. So let me save this. Let's just make sure that it compiles fine. So it recompiles every time you save one of the files. So let's make sure that all worked. Because it's tough to kind of remember all these different modules. You have to read the documents a lot. Yeah, looks like I actually remembered it correctly. Yay me. Okay, so those are installed, so now we don't have to worry about going back and forth to do that. But before I actually start using the forms module and the HTTP client, because it's a whole thing, let's just talk a little bit about how this works. So what I'm going to do is go into the HTML. Let's clear this all out. So we're going to clear out all this sort of default demo text. See, right here it says end the placeholders where you can start deleting. Which is pretty much the whole file. So let's just get rid of all this. Oh, looks like I did misspell one of the libraries. Okay, we'll come back to that. So we just save this. So just say this likely means that the library, which declares has not been processed correctly by ngcc or is it compatible with Angular IV. Check if a new version of the library is available. Explore, yeah, and then see HTTP client. It's probably, let's take a look. HTTP client modules, techniques, fundamentals, template, displaying data, attributes, structural, lots of stuff. Okay, I'll just look it over here. HTTP client. Here we go. HTTP client module. So it is. I did have to have the word module. So let's get back to VS Code. We just save this, and then go over here and save this. And on the benefit, at least in the bottom, it kind of tells you what's a problem. Okay. Well, it's rebuilding again. Let me just save this a second time. So it sees that it's HTTP client module now. And looks like that's fine at the moment. So here in the template, you can just literally put in things like hello world. Let's do that. H1 hello world. Save. Okay, so this all works the way you're kind of used to things working. And it's probably still erroring for that other thing. Let's do a Control-Shift-I. Did I save the HTML? Yeah. There it goes. Hello world. Just took some time. So now, if I want to use data, like if I want to interpolate data, what you have to do is first you have to show it in the TypeScript file for that particular component. So every component has a class. So this is the app component class. And then you can just put little variable. I'll get rid of this variable. I don't need this. I'm just going to say my name is a variable. And again, this is TypeScript, so it's using the latest sort of TypeScript features. So notice here I can just do class properties. I don't have to do all this constructor nonsense to create all the properties like in older iterations of JavaScript. So my name is Alex Merced. So there's a property of the app component, and any data inside this app component class I can then in turn use in my components template. So I can get rid of this instead of, I can just interpolate it. And just like any other templating library, you can put any kind of valid expression inside these double curly brackets. So let's go over here. Let's see how that changes. And see, it takes the data. Nice. Okay, so that's your basic, templating benefits of using Angular. So now let's actually build out our thing. Okay, so again, we're building out a to-do app. So I'm going to change the name of this back to to-do. And a couple things we need. First, we need to grab all the existing to-dos and render them to the screen. You could just import Axios for fetch and use that, but what they'd like you to do is use the HTTP client module. So what we need to do is we need to generate a service. Okay, a service is just kind of like a support thing. Okay, it allows you to take one of the modules, create like a support object that'll support you in a way. Okay, ng generate service, and we're going to call this API call. And that's going to generate a service file here in the app directory. It just takes a second for the kind of generate all that. So ng generate, and then what are you generating? A service? What? An API call. And the API call is just the name. It could be anything. It's just ng generate, what kind of file, service, API call. If I wanted to generate a new component, I would type in ng generate component, name of the component. Okay, so here we go, and that's right here. See, API call service spec. Again, all the spec.ts files, those are all to do with testing, so you can kind of ignore those unless you're doing testing. And here we are. So what I need to do here is I need to import HTTP client. Yeah, I want to look at my previous example. This gets a little complicated at this point. So let's see here. I did this once before just to kind of make sure that I knew where this was going to go. And I have that right over here. Data.service.ts. Let's take a kind of look at what it did. So we have to import HTTP client. That's what I thought we were going to have to do. But yes. So my memory is not completely failing me. Cool. So we have to import the library HTTP client there. You don't need to do anything with the decorator. That just means you can inject the service. It's a dependency that can be injected. Okay, and then, yeah, basically we'll set up a property called URL. Doesn't matter what you call the property. It's just the idea is that way it grabs the base URL of the API that we're going to be using. And then this is important. This is what brings the actual HTTP client tools into the okay, so basically we're just saying, hey, constructor, private HTTP client, because that's what it's going to do. When this particular service gets called, it's going to inject this module into it. and we have to specify that. Okay, and then those are just functions. Okay, so we can create those ourselves. So at that point, it's done. Now you create your functions that you want this object to sort of do. Okay. So then what I'm going to do is we're going to just create a function called getToDos. Again, these are just normal class methods. Now getToDos doesn't require any arguments because we're just grabbing all the to-dos. Okay, and then we have to do like this dot, and then we have to use, this is the name of our HTTP client here. So it's going to be this dot HTTP client. Dot get. Okay. And just remember the exact syntax. So over here, to-dos, get-to-dos, dot get, and then we just pass in the URL. And I gotta specify, that's right, because in TypeScript, we get full-on class stuff. So we have to make sure we specify whether things are public or private. So public just means you can use it outside of the class. So basically, people who are using this service can access this function. So HTTP client.get, and then we have the URL up there. So this.url. So it's just going to make a GET request to that URL, and we want to return that. So we're going to return that. Good. And what it does, with the way Angular does it, is that it returns an observable, not just data. And then what you do is you subscribe to the observables data. So when the data becomes available, it passes it on to you. I haven't worked that much with RxJS observables, but that's essentially what it's using under the hood. So that's all we need at the moment. Let's bring that back. Okay, save. So that function allows us to grab the to-dos. So now we can go back to our app component. Okay, and now we need to import that thing. Okay, so import. I think it's API. What was it called? API call service. From. It exists in the same folder, and the file is called API call service, and you don't need to include the file extension. API call service right there. Cool. Good. And then I think now we do need a constructor to inject that in there. Let me just remember how that syntax is going to look. App dot, look at my previous version. App dot component ts, and yeah. So we got it. Oh, and we got to also import on init. You'll see why in a moment. On init is just isn't part of, it's just part of the core module, so you don't need to create a whole new module import in the module file. It's just something that's in there. It's the lifecycle function. It just means that you can specify something to do when the component loads. So if you're familiar with like will component load in React, that's what this is. And then we want to make sure that it adds in its an interface in TypeScript, so it implements the interface. So it's like a thing that you can kind of add to a class. Implements on init. There we go. Okay, and then we do want the constructor, so let me go take a look at the syntax for that. And it's just kind of very similar to how we saw it before. We're just kind of injecting it via the constructor's parameters. So let's see here. It all has to do with the way like the Angular builder, because at the end of the day, Angular apps are compiled through its own now its new IV compiler. So it's going to look at the constructor and then just know to pass in certain things. It just builds it out for you. So you just have to follow the way. You just have to follow the Angular syntax, and the compiler will just figure it out for you. So by the fact that I defined that this, we'll call it API. Let's keep it simple, and it's a API call service because that's a service we created. It sees this and knows, okay, we need to pass the API call service here. We're just going to do that when we create this component in the underlying JavaScript that it puts out. And if Angular feels a little more complicated than React, it does feel at first. It gets easier the more you learn, but it's all, again, the steepest learning curve of all the front-end frameworks we'll go over. But there are jobs. Okay, so that should have injected the service. So now the only thing we really need to do is actually make the call. So we have to do the onInit function, since we've implemented it into our class, and then here we would just use the thing. So this dot API dot get to dos, I think was the name of the function. So where's our, so let's close some of these Windows app components. We don't need this anymore. This is the component. Yeah, see, ng on init. I want to look at our service, API call service. We called it get to dos. Get to dos, there's no argument that takes. And then we would subscribe. That means we're going to get the information from it. And then here we pass in a callback with the data. Comes back, although I think that takes 2 arguments. Oh no, I have to just type it. So in TypeScript, you're typing things. So basically, you can specify what something should look like. So I'm specifying that, hey, this should look like an array of anything. And that's all that means. That doesn't like that. Oh no, I just need to finish the arrow function, that's why. So that just means that when that data variable comes in, it has to be an array of anything. The reason why you like to do that is just that you catch errors if something that you don't expect comes in. Okay, and then we have the data, and what I want to do is create a property called to-dos. It'll start out as an empty array, but when this runs, that will become equivalent to the data. Okay, now that's got to be this.todos because it's a class property. So there we go. Okay. Yeah, that's it. And then when you get lazy in TypeScript, you can just always just put in the any type, which just means this can be anything. The only reason you don't want to do that is because then you don't get the benefit of typing, which is all the errors that specify when you pass the wrong type of data to something. But again, this is not a TypeScript video. You can watch my TypeScript videos if you want. Okay, so let's see here. So that means now when this component renders, we're going to grab those to-dos. So now what we need to do is make sure that when those to-dos come in, that they get rendered to the template. So we have to go back to our HTML template. And the way this works, we'll just do like an H2. Okay, and there is what's called a directive. So Angular has all these directives. They're actually quite simple in the old Angularjs. They became a little bit, the syntax is a little bit more complicated in the newer Angular, although it can do more. So you would just do this, ng for. Okay, that means you're going to do a for loop, and then you put quotation marks, and I want a for loop, so for every to-do of to-dos. Okay, and then I can specify what the index is for each in the array. So I can say index as index, meaning it's just the variable name is index. And then there's a third thing you can put in there that I've never had to use. So there's a third thing we have to put that second semicolon, so that way it knows that there's nothing for that third piece of the argument. Okay, so that's just going to loop whatever is inside this H2. It'll just loop each time. So all I'm doing is saying, hey, for each to-do, make an H2, and then inside put in the text of the to-do. Okay, and then that's what that should do. Loop over, and we should have all the to-dos once they load up. Toot, 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 toot. think I did the syntax wrong because I don't see any bad API calls in here. Let's take a look at the call come through. ng WebSocket. I think that's probably the call right there. So let's go back over here. Let me go to, first off, let's make sure that the API call is working. So let me add a console log. Data, make sure that the data is what I think it is. And in this case, like, it's not like React where there's state and then all your other data. Any property inside the component is reactive. If the property inside the class changes, it's gonna update the component, update the DOM. So here I'm gonna refresh this. Let's see if we get that console log. Okay, did I save? I did save. This API.getToDos. Let's see here. Let's compare to my previous one. Okay, no, that's pretty the same thing. This data service get to dos. This .api, which is, we called it API right here. Get to dos subscribe data any console.log data. This .to dos equals data. Let me just make sure there's anything else I am missing here. On init component, that's all fine. To dos. I still spell subscribe right. Get dos. Yeah, that all looks good to me. Let's also double check the ng4. So let's take a look at the old projects. HTML, make sure I did the ng4 right. ng4 let to do of, oh, the let, I forgot the let. Let to do of to dos. Oh, and injected all this in there. Boo. Okay, and then we need that other semicolon here. There we go, save. Wait for it to re-render, to do. Get the API call. Is still failing. So let's examine. Let's first examine the service and compare it to the service I did before. Data service. Get to dos return this .http client .get. And what did I do over here? Yeah, this .http client .get, this URL. Is there anything I forgot to import? No, injectable provided in, localhost. Constructor private. This URL. Let me just make sure that server's still running. Yep, it's still running. Oh, well, I should have checked over here. Is declared here. Let's see here. Is missing type app component but required in type on init. Why? So let's compare there. So that's where the issue is. It is the on init implements on init. Let's go look at the older version. Let me just close some of these other things. And we do bring in on init there. Data.service. No, this would be app component.ts. Implements on init. On init. Oh, it's ng on init. Okay. My bad. And it's like saying that right in the error too. It's saying ng on init. Come on, you need to use that. Okay, save. Now we should be good. And there it goes. That looks good. And there, so you grabbed all our to-dos. Good. So grabbed all of our to-dos. Now we just need to create a button. So let's just sketch that out. Input type equals text. And then we use our ng model directive. So you just do this for two-way binding. And that's going to equal, we'll call it a variable called input. And that's that. And then basically we go back to our app component.ts. We just need to make a variable called input, which is an empty string to start out with. And essentially that form, when you type in the form, it always updates that variable. So that variable is always going to hold the input. So now we just need to create a function in our API service that handles that call. So let's go back to our API call service. Let's create another function for posting. So public add to do. This will take an argument of to do, the text of the new to do, and then this will make a return this dot http client dot post, which will take the URL, then the body of the request, which will be to do, and then I need to pass in the object with headers. And again, for headers, I need to pass in content type because it's JSON. It's looking for JSON data. Application JSON. Cool. Save. So that function is created. Now I go to my component, and we will make a function that we can call from our button. So we'll create a add to dos here. Add to dos. Okay. And what this function does is that it does this dot API dot add to dos and passes in the input, whatever the current value of the input is. And then we're going to subscribe to it. And then we just take the data it returns again. And we will console log it just to make sure that it's working. And then again, what it does, so again, if you remember when we built our API, it returns all the newest list of to-dos. So this dot to-dos equals data. Cool. So that works so far. So now we just need a button. So we go over here, we add a button. Okay, and the click event looks like this. Click equals, and that's just going to be add to-dos is the name of the function. Then we have the button, and we just say click me or submit. There you go. So every time we click this button, it should just run that function. So whenever you're doing Angular click events, that's the syntax. It's a parentheses with the word click in it. And let's see, I cannot find the input. Oh, that's supposed to be this dot input, because again, input's in a property of the class. So this dot input. Save. So at least the errors are pretty good in Angular. Like, it'll tell you what you're screwing up. Let's see here, compiled successfully. Let's take a look. And now we have a button. And I'll type in like go get haircut, submit, and it did not work. So let's see what happened. Error, this API to use is not a function. Did I call it something else? Let's see here, API call service. Add to do. Ah. Safe. That's the one annoying thing about Angular. You're working a lot of files, so you have to try to keep everything consistent. Get haircut. And that's bad request. It didn't like my request. Okay, say respond 400 bad requests. Oh yeah, I need to send it. I know why. What we need to do is pass in an object. So what we'll do is here, we need to pass in an object with a property called to do. That's what it's looking for. There we go. Save. That goes back to when we built our API. It grabs a to do from the body and works from there. I didn't give it that. Okay. Get haircut. And now it works. Get haircut. And there you go. We made an application. This took a little longer. Angular's a little complicated. It has a little bit of a setup cost. It does get faster as you set everything up. So if you're making a very big, robust application, there are benefits to all this boilerplate, to all this setup. But if you're making a small little to-do application like this, as you can see, it can be a little overkill in sort of the time it takes to set up and the amount of thinking that goes